Hello!
Hello. Welcome to the Le Chataigneraie guest speaker interviews with Jennifer Yu and Alicia Lejnev. Today we have the pleasure of talking to screenwriter Paul Laverty. Um, and so, you are a screenwriter. We were just wondering, could you please briefly introduce yourself, sort of what you do, where are you from? Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you very much for taking time. My apologies to John, who you know very, very well, who's been trying to get me to come for many, many years. I wish I could, but sometimes we just we need another lifetime. But
Yeah.
so it's very good to make contact. And also in this world now, I suppose, you know, when there's so much crisis with environment, it's good not to fly so much. So
Yeah, for sure.
although I would love to have met you in person and had that Glenmorangie from John, but that's I'll get that when he comes back to Scotland. Well, my name is Paul Laverty. I suppose for the last 30 odd years I've been a screenwriter. I ended up in this job by accident. I didn't plan it, like most things in my life. I qualified as a lawyer a way back. But to cut a very, very long story short, what happened was when I finished my law apprenticeship and became a lawyer, in my mid-20s, when you're often curious about life and want to learn another language, I went to work in a Central American country called Nicaragua, which was then going we'd just been through a revolution in 1979. They kicked out the American-backed dictator Somoza, and there was a Sandinista revolution. And to cut another very long story short, there was a revolution, and the Sandinistas took power. They tried to do very basic things that would, you know, that would have helped the country. They taught the country to read and write, which was absolutely key. A remarkable, they called it the alphabetization, teaching people to read and write through the use of students in a pyramid fashion. You know, they wiped out polio. They did very, very good things. But anyway, the United States were determined to crush this revolution, and they funded the ex-soldiers of the dictator Somoza. And for 10 years, there was a war. A civil war. Well, it wasn't really a civil war because it was a war imposed by the United States using mercenaries and the Contra. And so it attracted many, many young people who wanted to go and help the revolution, try to help and do things. And I was one of the many people who went there, and it ended up working for a human rights organization. Mm-hmm. And so it was that period there, you know, an eyewitness to the war that really, I suppose, got me to think of writing, because I was sick and tired of writing human rights reports, interviewing people like what you're doing just now. I did that to a lot of you know, visiting people who came to Nicaragua. Mm-hmm. And I decided in my wisdom that I was going to try and write a screenplay, but I knew nothing about cinema. So it started a grand adventure, and it took a long time to get our first film made. But a key moment was, you know, when I came back from Nicaragua, and I wrote to many directors, but I wrote to Ken Loach, and I had the great piece of luck there. We made our first film. Sorry, I didn't mean to go on as long as that. You have to learn to interrupt the, you know, someone who's
this is so interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much. Then should we get started on our questions?
Yes.
Okay. So, would you like to start?
I think you.
Okay. So as we touched on just now, before you became a screenwriter, you worked as a human rights, you worked in human rights in Nicaragua. So how has that experience shaped your perspective as a writer? And do you find yourself drawing on it when crafting your characters and narratives?
It's a really good question. That it's very hard to know and put your finger on, you know, what you've experienced and how that expresses itself in the writing. But I suppose as writers, you're a bit like magpies. You steal everything and anything. You know, when you sit down to write, I think our imaginations just, you know, soak up everything we can, and we use it somehow. But being in Nicaragua for that period of time, and also in Central America, I went to El Salvador and Guatemala, which were going through. El Salvador again was going through another terrible period, you know. And when I went to those countries, I saw remarkable things. So terrible repression, but also met great, you know, immense bravery. You know, I met human rights organisers who were not sleeping in the same place 2 consecutive nights in a row because, you know, they're being hunted down. Mm-hmm. So to meet people like that who are still determined to fight for human rights in their countries, but at the same time, if they'd been caught, would have paid a heavy price for it. You never forget that bravery. You never forget that resilience. That was in El Salvador and Guatemala. And in Nicaragua, I suppose I saw war up relatively close as well. I spoke to people whose families had been kidnapped by the Contra back in the United States. Incredible cruelty, devastated lives. And in a strange way, going back to your question, Jennifer, I don't think I could have written The Wind That Shakes the Barley, the film I did in Ireland, if I hadn't been to Nicaragua. Because, people romanticize war. And, that's what I realized by being in Nicaragua and talking to people who have been involved in it, they're often decimated by the experience. Even people, many young people, who have experienced violence, it devastates their lives. I actually spoke to, I'll never forget this young guy I spoke to who had been trained by the Americans. And it was during a ceasefire. And he told me how after an ambush, he'd finished people off. Murdered them, tortured them. And he was a broken man. He's obviously in drugs and he's obviously drinking. And I realised that he was another victim. He'd done terrible things, but he'd been trained by the CIA and the United States authorities to go and cause terror in Nicaragua. I spoke to him, I saw it in his face, and it always stuck with me. So when we did, I don't know if you've seen The Wind That Shakes the Barley, it's a film in Ireland. But there's a line by Cillian Murphy, the actor, that you do recognise his name. I have no idea why. I have no idea. I can't think of any good reason. But anyway, there's a line that the character Cillian says, "We've crossed a line, Sinead. We've crossed a line," and he was different by his experience. And I think that came, going back to your question, Jennifer. I think that came out of that experience, and many others too. You realise how fragile life is, and the biggest lesson, I suppose, is you ask really big questions about how power operates in their lives. Who was financing that? Who created the narrative to that war in Nicaragua? In fact, many of the same people. It's the same false logic we see in many other parts of the country. The United States said the Contra, who are carrying out gross human rights, abuses. This is not me saying this. I saw that. I know that. But Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, many of these bona fide human rights organisations were saying they were guilty of systematic and gross violations of human rights against the civilian population. But the United States government was calling them freedom fighters. They were calling them the equivalent of our founding fathers. So fake news and grand lies have been around with us for a very long time. To see that up close when you're in your 20s was a great lesson. I've never forgotten that either. So I learned a lot of lessons, Jennifer, from Nicaragua.
Thank you.
So thank you very much. Obviously, you had a lot of experience with human rights law. You also studied in philosophy, right, in Rome. And so I was just wondering, what was the turning point that sort of made you realize that you want to write films and not continue practicing law?
Well, when I did my law apprenticeship and I started practicing as a lawyer, I had great fun actually. I met a very good colleague who I'm still very friendly with. There's a guy called Kenny McCaskill who went on to be the minister in the Scottish Parliament. And what we did was we were kind of left to our own devices. So we did a lot of cases that had political overtones, and we just got stuck in and we used law as a device almost, so we'd raise actions about homelessness or lost gyro checks for welfare, and sometimes even there was occupation of factories. So we, as much as we could, we tried to follow our instinct, and I suppose we were interested in how law operated, in those areas. But I was determined. I was in my mid-20s. I wanted to learn another language. I wanted to go and travel. So the excitement of going off to Nicaragua was immense. But I couldn't speak any Spanish, so I had to learn Spanish first. And I went there first. The first time I went, I just picked coffee, learned some Spanish, tried to figure out how the whole thing operated. So I suppose it was curiosity for the world, and I was so glad to escape an office, so glad to escape a suit, and ever since then I've been trying to escape an office. So I've been very lucky.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And so, whether in law or in film, your work often focuses on the struggles of ordinary people and social issues. So, what motivated you to dedicate your career to telling these kinds of stories? And do you see it as a form of activism?
Yes. Well, the thing about a screenplay is it's very, very hard to get a film made, believe it or not. I had tremendous luck because, I met, the most brilliant director. And then I had double luck because we became great friends and we realised that we enjoyed working with each other so much. We had enormous fun. But the great thing was that because of Ken's reputation and his history, and also because of our relationship with another key figure in our lives who doesn't get half the respect that she deserves, is Rebecca O'Brien, our producer. Because they raise the finance and do all the engine work so that we can do the creative work. So from the very, very beginning, I've always written about what I was passionate about. I mean, I wrote, the first one was a film called Canción de Carla, Carla's Song. And then there was a young actor called Robbie Carlyle, who became very, very well known. He was in the film Monty and Trainspotting and all of that. And we got that first film made. So that film came out of my experience in Nicaragua. And so I didn't know. I mean, I was driven. I just felt, conscience bound to try and write something about the war, and we did. But that took about 5 years, a long, long time. But after we finished that film, Ken asked me if I'd write another story closer to home in Glasgow. We did a film called My Name Is Joe, with a wonderful actor called Peter Mullen, who went on to win the Best Actor in Cannes that year. So that was closer to my own experience, in Glasgow. But I suppose my point is, if you're going to write about something and spend so much of your life doing it, write about something that interests you and you're passionate about. So I was, but the story must come first. It's not a thesis. A film is not a thesis. If I sit down and say, right, I'm going to tell you about, the history of poverty in Glasgow, everybody would yawn and fall asleep. But if you've got a guy who has got the possibility of exploding, he stopped drinking, he's going to AA, you're kind of rooting for him, and he's trying to start his life off after, a desperate hiatus of, alcohol. But he's running the worst football team in Glasgow. He's funny, he's comic, he wants to start his life again. That's a story. So the story must come first, and then if the premise to the story and the conflict you've planted in that premise works, then you've got a story. It was Bertolt Brecht said, there's no fun without the show. He was a brilliant writer from Germany in the 1920s. I don't know. Do you know his work, Bertolt Brecht? Did you ever study that at school? Did you ever study that in literature? Look him up. Bertolt Brecht, and he did amazing plays and amazing songs. And so have a look at Bertolt Brecht. But he wrote in, he was deeply political, but he wanted to tell a story. And if you don't tell a story and get that right, you're Then I found out I just really enjoyed it. I didn't know, because I didn't know until I tried. I didn't know how to write a screenplay. I had to read some books and I made lots of mistakes. Ken was obviously a great guide. But at the same time, you've got to have the appetite to write. When I remember sitting down to write, and just the sheer exhilaration of it, it was like a drug. And to be honest, even now when I start, writing, it's a remarkable feeling, really. I find, deep satisfaction in it. An agitated state, it might be difficult, but, you've got to be drawn to it, somehow or another, and I still am. So I was just lucky to find it, because I'm sure there's many, many other people who have that inside them, but I've never had the luck, to try it. So, yeah, so I feel I've just been lucky beyond words, really.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you again, we researched a bit about you, and we saw that you won the Fulbright Award, right? Which is like the cultural exchange program LA, which allowed you to study film in Los Angeles. And I just wanted to know, how did that opportunity sort of shape your understanding of film, of the craft, and what were your first impressions of the film industry at that stage?
See, my life has been a series of accidents. I won the Fulbright Award. I know it's very prestigious, but I won it by accident. You know, it had very little to do with me. I'd written a screenplay, and I can't even remember who it was now, but they knew about this. What happened was, John will remember this character. You have to ask John about a guy called John Cleese, right? And he was of our generation, and they set up an amazing company called, called Monty Python, and it was kind of surreal, absurdist humor, from the UK in the 60s. But I mean, it went around the world. And John Cleese became a famous comedian. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he was defamed by the Sun, or one of Murdoch's rags. You know who Robert Murdoch is? He's the owner of lots of newspapers. He's in his 90s now. He was a poisoned old bastard, and really right. He really was. Everything that's bad about human nature. He was racist, he was misogynist. Had all these newspapers with the, women exposing themselves. He was totally right wing. He was a great fan of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan and all these people. Anyway, so John Cleese sued him, and he got a whole pile of money. And with that money, he set up the Fulbright. He contacted Fulbright and said, "I'll finance, a place for one British screenwriter every year to go to Los Angeles, to go wherever you want, And so he'd fund it. So anyway, to cut a long story short, I ended up winning this prize, So I thought, oh well, I was skint, I had no money, and but I really thought, well, if I go to Los Angeles, that'll be interesting because I'll meet a lot of Latinos. I could speak Spanish. Maybe I'll find something there. And I went along to a film school there called USC, which is very prestigious.
Oh yes, yeah.
It was very prestigious, and it was harder to get into that film school than Harvard Unit Law School. Anyway, I went along there, and to be honest, it was tedious. It was really boring. I thought there was a young lad, I remember, who wrote a screenplay about a monkey and a policeman, and he sold it for $1 million, and it was like poison. Everybody wanted to write, some stupid story like that. And I thought it'd be a fascinating, interesting place, and it wasn't. It was dead. At least it struck me as very boring. But there was a great old Czech guy there called Frank Daniels, and he used to show his favourite films once every Thursday afternoon. And he would show a film like The Apartment. It was a great Billy Wilder. If you get a chance to see that film, it works like clockwork. I mean, it's an old film, long before you were born. It was ancient, but he would analyse it, and so I learned a lot from listening to him. So instead of going to the lectures, what I did was I wanted to dig in and use the money to find out what was going on in Los Angeles. And there was this great union campaign. It was called Justice for Janitors. So it was all these people who come up from Latin America who'd come across the border running from poverty, and they were working like slaves in Los Angeles in some of the banks and the agencies and the lawyers. So they were working like dogs. They had to get 3 jobs a week to survive. And then they decided to try and organise a union so they get fair pay. But the most important thing was, if you did get a union contract, you would get healthcare for your children. But if they did try and join, the authorities and the companies, who wanted to keep them oppressed, said, we'll contact the Migra, which was the immigration department, so you get sent back to your country. So it was a great time there. So I spent time with them, and I saw how they organised, and they had kind of guerrilla-like tactics. They would go up to and invade, like fancy restaurants and say, how's your fish and chips there? How's your caviar? How's your shrimps? How much did that cost? And I would talk to these executives over the table, and would go to their offices and invade their buildings. So that was much more fun than boring old classes about how to write a script. So these people were great, and they were heroic people. People who had crossed borders from El Salvador and Guatemala. Then they'd be caught, they were sent back again, then they were safe for another 4 years. They were great people. So anyway, we did a film called Bread and Roses, and Adrian Brody, who just won the Oscar for The Brutalist. Yeah, and he was the main character in our film called Bread and Roses. And so we worked with the people there, and so to be honest, it was a very interesting experience again, because I met great people in the room, dramatic lives, people who were deemed to be insignificant, and they were brilliant people. So I'm so glad we made a film about it with them. And then that was the only time that Ken Loach ever did a film in the United States. So it was another great experience, because I think we have to remember too, you never know how a film's going to turn out. Some of our films have worked out very, very well, and other ones have not been so good. But what you can do is enjoy the adventure, enjoy the journey. You meet great people. You try and be radical and truthful to the characters and to the stories and the premise. And if you do that, you'll be enriched in the journey, and you'll meet great people, irrespective of the job you've made of the script. So in every film, we've met great people, and that is deeply nourishing.
Thank you. And as we've mentioned a couple of times, your collaboration with Ken Loach has led to some of your most iconic films. Amazing. So what is the creative dynamic between you two, and how has your partnership shaped your approach to storytelling?
Well, I mean, Ken is I've had two, Ken and myself have done 14 films together. And I've also done 3 films with my partner, Alicia, a Spanish director. And for both Ken and Alicia, I've learned so much from them. But essentially, especially with Ken, because we've done so many films together, we both do very different jobs. Ken is a director, and I'm a writer, and we meet in the middle as filmmakers, And the wonderful thing about working with Ken was, well, he's 20 years older than me. He has so much experience. He's one of the sharpest men I've ever met in my whole life. He's actually, quite apart from being a filmmaker, he's a brilliant man. A lovely man, intelligent man who cares about the world, who's deeply truthful to his own politics throughout his whole life. So he's becoming an immense and a very close friend. He'll be 89 at his next birthday. So we're both in mourning about not doing the next film, to be honest. But our last film was The Old Oak. But I learned so much from Ken. But the relationship worked because there's no big egos, I suppose we're both joined at the hip politically, So the big questions that how we view life and how we and our sensibilities, we never had to talk about it really, because it was just there. I don't know if you've got a good friend that you just feel totally ease with, like a soulmate. I was going to suggest that. You look like you understand each other. You understand each other. You probably share many of the deep values. You're not clones of each other. You share something deeply in common. Ken came from, there was 20 years of a difference. Ken came from England, I came from Scotland, but we met together in our politics and how we viewed life. It's very, very funny. We kind of laugh at the same things. We both love football. We're fascinated by politics, how it works, how power operates. So that was the bedrock to the relationship. And then when we, and I suppose we trust each other, and and then, so we would talk maybe about something that would be fascinating, and often, but Ken would never tell me what to write, and that was good, because I've got to find that. I've got to make it my own. So what I would do is, I remember the very last day of the shoot in Carlos song in Nicaragua, everybody got very ill and he was crawling in places. He said, "Oh, for Christ's sake, write something closer to home, will you? Try something in Glasgow." And then he got on the plane and he left. And then I just, well, that's a good idea. I would love to write something in Glasgow, because I didn't assume we would do another film. And this character of Joe, and my name is Joe, came to mind. An idea that he wanted to try and start his life again, and then his partner. And I just wrote up a description of the 2 characters, and I faxed it. You know what a fax is these days, but I faxed it. I wrote it out by John will be giggling away in the back there. I wrote it out by hand. My handwriting's terrible. You find a post office and then you put it through a machine, and then a horrible copy comes out the other end. So I faxed Ken with this. It sounds like pigeons, doesn't it? Anyway, you'll be looking at what a fax means next. So anyway, so he was kind of he just goes go and write it. And that's what I did. I went back up to Glasgow, dug around, come back from Nicaragua, and I had to and I went up to a place, John might know it. There's a place called Possil. It's a really tough park in Glasgow.
Yes, know it well, Paul.
So there was a I had no place to stay because I've been traveling for so long. So there was an old church up there, and it was a church house next door to it. It was huge and it was empty. So they used to take in a few students. So I rented a room there, and it was in Possil Park. And everything in My Name Is Joe just happened around that house. So it was true to the neighbourhood, and the conditions and the choices that people made. And that was a beautiful thing about that. Then Ken came up to Glasgow, and then I would introduce him to the people I'd met in the research, and then we would just try and make the script tighter and tighter, and it was a coming and going, but we did different jobs. And then because the way I've worked, oftentimes I'll meet people who might be interested, who might use in the film. Many of the locations that were in My Name Is Joe were just outside my door. I showed Ken, and we shot the whole film around the house. So, and then when he was researching, he says, well, let's do another one, and then another one. So we didn't have a 5-year plan, but here we are, 30 years later, we've done 14 films together. But he's a gem, an absolute. And if you can find, and that's the beautiful thing about cinema as well, it's collaborative. You can have a great screenplay and a crap director. You have a great screenplay and a great director, and you can't do well with your actors. It all falls apart. So it's a much more fragile process than you think. And there's a very short period of time when you have to do it. People have to stay healthy. You have to have luck with the weather, all sorts of stuff. So it's a very fragile process, but absolutely intoxicating because you get out of bed in the morning and you just want to make it. So it's a wonderful job if you can find the right collaborators. And what was very, very important to us too, absolutely key, was we had freedom to do what we wanted. Whereas most writers and most directors don't do that now. They're dictating, who will be in it, what the budget is. They'll try and change the script, the title, all sorts of crap, And then so we've passed a very golden period of keeping our stories very, very cheap. So nobody could tell us what to do, and then you get a little bit of money here, there, and everywhere. So nobody tells you what to do. So our freedom was absolutely key to how we worked.
Thank you. Great. And so sort of as a last question, looking back at your career, are there any moments that stand out to you as particularly transformative or turning points in your development as a screenwriter? And what advice would you give to young writers hoping to follow in your footsteps?
Well, I mean, the turning point really was the great luck of meeting Ken. But you make your luck. I came back from Nicaragua and I must have written to about 200 people. Most of them who said, "Are you joking?" No, but most of them didn't even answer. Then there was quite a few who did answer, and the subtext was, "You've never written a screenplay, and you want us to go off to Central America, a war-torn country where there's no movie, no film industry, and so the implication was you haven't got a chance." So I didn't care about that. I knew I was going to get that film made. It sounds totally arrogant to say that, but I just had a sense that I would find people to make it. And I did. And I was lucky. But you make your luck as well by writing to lots and lots of people and keeping at it. So, but again, there was a great element of luck in that. And then I suppose after that was that I found somebody with a sensibility that was compatible. And that's a great deal of luck. So I think people who are going to write screenplays, they have to be very, very canny. I think it's a very difficult job, really. First of all, you've got to have the appetite for it. And I suppose you've got to have the talent for it. But oftentimes you don't know you've got the talent for it or not. There's real questions of doubt and also so it's quite tricky to be canny about your own talents, So, I've met people who started off at the same time as me. They're still trying to write screenplays, and for whatever reason, they've never had any made. And that's very, very painful. Now, you could say it's also bad luck. You could say it's maybe, well, they're writing in a way that perhaps they might be terrific and might be very interesting, but they've not found the partners by which you can get it made and onto screen. So people have to be very canny and to really think, think about it do you know that word? It's a good, John will tell you that word, canny. Do you know that word, canny?
It's kind of, yeah, like a bit like self.
You're self-aware. You know what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great word.
You've got to be very, very shrewd, because filmmaking, it's an expensive process. It's not like sitting down and writing a poem. It's not like sitting down and writing a short story. You've got to raise millions of pounds. Even for a short, our films are very, very cheap. You try to keep it very low, £4 or £5 million. Now, that wouldn't pay for a Hollywood actor's handbag during a shoot in Hollywood. They charge fortunes. But if we keep it low, that means we keep control of it. That we try and they'll let them take a chance with us. So you've got to be canny that way. And as for giving advice to people, well, I'm always very wary of that. I think people have to find their own journey. Really, have to find their own way. I became a screenplay by accident, and so I think people just have to be true to themselves. H.G. Wells, a wonderful writer who wrote amazing stuff. I mean, I understand he hardly ever left his room. He just wrote it at home. Like for me, I wanted to travel the world. I wanted to see the world. I wanted to taste the world. I was curious about everything. Probably because I was at seminary from the age of 12 till 20. I was locked up. I felt like a greyhound in a cage. So when I got out of there, I was like a dog off to the next lamppost. And I was just totally intoxicated by what was out there. So I think it helps if you're curious, and so I'm always interested in people's lives. I think listening to people is incredibly important for the type of writing I do. For my type of writing, you don't copy it off the street, but if you can sit down and talk to someone and try and understand the world from their point of view, they will give you gems that you will never have imagined. Now, you might not use it in the same way that they have, but it'll make you think in another way. I mean, this interview, I would much rather sit down and ask you questions. I would love to know, where have you come from? Why are you studying in Switzerland? It sounds like a place of, it sounds like I can see you've got dedicated teachers like John who are curious about the world. I would, that's a tremendous experience. I'd love to know, well, what are you going to do with it all? What are your plans next? I mean, I would much rather interview you than you interview me. So I think a writer has to have that. I think a writer's got to have that type of curiosity, and also I think not only as a writer, but as a human being and as a citizen, I think the big question, especially if we've had the privilege of education, is to try and imagine and understand and decipher and be rigorous and be tough and be radical and ask, how is power operating in our lives? And to me, that is even more important now than ever. I've never seen, such barbarism, such concentration of wealth, such cruelty, and how does that come about? I mean, all we have to do is look at Gaza just now, and see how Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, and if you get a chance, to you and your colleagues, I don't know if you're going to write this up, try and have a look at this organisation called Forensic Architecture in Goldsmiths. Now, that's one of the most remarkable documents of our time. And an 823-page report. It's run by this remarkable Israeli academic called Ian Wiseman. They've set up it's an interactive site called Cartography of Genocide, and it's the absolute proof that genocide is taking place. And what they do is they build up patterns. They use thousands of geolocations and points, and it's totally rigorous. Everything's corroborated, and it's been totally ignored. So how does that happen? How can someone produce all that evidence? It is there, and then it's ignored, and then everybody just shuts up about it. Western Europe, have virtually denied it. United States deny it.
Yeah.
and the conscience is on the streets. You know, our institutions have denied it. You know, but look at that document. You know, understand how it works. You know, it says, well, let's look at it, and it uses all the little videos out from IDF, the stuff done from phones from people in Gaza, and it builds up a pattern and a picture. So it's an amazing piece of rigorous research done by a team in Goldsmiths. You know, but it's amazing how all that evidence can be presented, but then it's totally ignored. You know, it's a wee bit like climate change, isn't it? You know, all that 95% consensus about what is happening, to our future, but it's totally and absolutely ignored. You know, this last year, we've used more fossil fuels in our entire history, but not only that, we've given more subsidies to our corporations in our history, and yet it's light in the face of science and how does that happen? You know, when power and power comes up against just rigorous academic studies. That's the amazing thing. If you're I suppose if you're a screenplay writer or a storyteller, you're fascinated by these contradictions. But then other people might be fascinated just by comedy or just telling a good yarn or a good story. So we need many, many voices. But the problem is, I think, is that many voices who are political, who ask tough questions of power, they don't get access to being commissioned. And then if they are commissioned, will their screenplays be made?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm asking. You have to learn to interrupt if you're going to be a good job.
No, that's okay. It was really interesting.
Really insightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's actually kind of funny because she's interested in pursuing law, and I'm interested in film.
Yes.
Oh, you've got a great team. Yeah.
so insightful,
Yeah,
and thank you so much for your time and your answers. Really, I'm
So,
taking a lot from.
What stage are you guys at now? Then are you going to go? Is this your last? Are you going to go to university now, or is this still university?
Yeah, second to last. We're in year 12, and we graduate in year 13. So.
And so, where are you going to study next? What are you going to study?
So I want to study law.
Whereabouts?
In the UK.
Oxford.
Oxford.
Glasgow, come on.
Okay, yeah, you might have changed my mind.
Well, I mean, it's a remarkable profession, and I learned a great deal from law, great rigor. You learn how to be rigorous. You'll bring those lessons to everything, no matter what you do. Most people who study law go on to do other things, but it's a great. And where do you want to study film, Alicia?
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna do like a foundation in business, I think, hopefully in Italy and Bocconi, but then I'll look to study film either in the UK or in the US.
Oh well, we might cross paths at a festival in the future.
She had a lot of interest in USC as well.
Yeah,
so
that's
why we were like.
Yeah.
Well, you can go and write a screenplay about a monkey and a policeman and make $1 million. I'm sure there was. Poor old USC. I'm sure there was many more interesting lecturers than that. But I was never a very good student. I was always better out talking to people. So it might be. I think you go to these places and learn what you can and watch great films. So I'm sure. I'm sure I'm doing them a terrible injustice. Good luck.
Thank you so much.
That's all. That's all. So thank you very much again for joining us. Thank you, Mr. Megan.
No, I can't see you. I can't see you.
There's the
there you are. Oh, there you are.
And the Glenn Morangi and the Jimmy Johnston videos are waiting for you. Okay.
Lovely to meet you at last, John. Hi. Thanks very much, Alicia. Thanks, Jennifer. And
bye.
Thanks, Finley. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.